أهلا بيكم أبنائنا وبناتنا طلاب وطالبات الصف الثاني الثانوي في حلقة جديدة لمادة البيولوجي. احنا الحين النهاردة هنركز عن السنسيتيفيتي ان مان، هنركز عن الترانسميشن اوف نيرف امبولسز ثرو ذا نيرف فايبرز عشان الناس بتتلخبط فيها شوية. هنوري جرافس وفيديوهات تورينا ازاي يحصل ترانسميشن للنيرف امبولسز، لان ده جزء مهم قوي احنا هنحتاجه في سنة تانية. هنحتاجه شوية برضو في سنة تالتة علشان نعرف ازاي المصل تعمل contraction. هنبدأ الجزء دون في ان احنا نعرف ازاي او ايه اللي بيحصل لو حصل stimulation of the nerve fiber at any point. كنا وصلنا في الحصة اللي فاتت او الحلقة اللي فاتت قلنا ان النيرف impulses النيرف fiber is polarized at rest. Polarized means the outer membrane is positive but the inner is negative and the potential difference negative 70 millivolt at rest. هنيجي دلوقتي نشوف لو حصل stimulation of the nerve impulses. نبص كده مع بعضنا. When the nerve cell is stimulated, its permeability or the permeability of the nerve membrane is changed. So, great amount of the positive sodium ions pass from inside the cell through the special channels causes depolarization at positive 40 millivolt. The amount of the positive potassium ions pass outside the cell to return its repolarization at negative 70 millivolt. That is called the repolarization. So that it changes the state of polarization into depolarization. نبص هنا على الجراف ده هيوضح لنا الحكاية دي قوي. That's nerve cell at rest. The outer membrane is positive, but the inner membrane is negative. The outer is positive, but the inner is negative. That is the channels of the sodium ions, which represented by the green poles, and that is the channels of the negative of the positive potassium ions, which represented by the blue poles. يبقى أنا عندي أدي الصوديوم ions اللي لونها جرين، ودي التشانلز اللي هتتحرك من خلالها، ودي البوتاسيوم ايونز اللي لونها بلو، ودي التشانلز البلو اللي هتتحرك منها البوتاسيوم ايونز. نبص لو حصل ستيميوليشن هنا ايه اللي بيجرى. لو حصل stimulation of the nerve membrane at any point, the selectively permeability of the membrane is changed. اللي حصل هنا ان حصل open of the channels of the sodium ions and close the channels of the potassium ions. So the sodium ions move from outside to inside. نبص هنا كده ادي الصوديوم ايونز اللي بره، channels مقفوله. نشوف التشانلز دي هتتفتح، نلاقي الصوديوم دخل من هنا ومن هنا، فهيغير لي الستيت بتاعه اللي كانت اسمها polarization هتتعكس يبقى اسمها depolarization. نلاحظ هنا ان الاوتر ممبرين هو اللي بقى نيجاتيف والانر ممبرين هو اللي بقى بوزيتيف، ولو قسنا البوزيتيفيتي بتاعه الممبرين ده هنلاقيها بوزيتيف 40 ملي فولت. احنا بنسمي الحكايه دي polarization. نبص على الجراف. كان at rest ال potential difference at negative 70 ملي فولت، وبعدين حصل stimulation. لما حصل stimulation الصوديوم ions move from outside to inside، يبقى النيجاتيفيتي اللي جوه دي بتقل، تفضل تقل لغايه ما يحصل نيوتراليزيشن عند الزيرو، وبعدين تدخل صوديوم ions يبقى اللي جوه البوزيتيف بيزيد لغايه ما يوصل للبوزيتيف 40 due to the passage of the sodium ions from outside to inside through the sodium channels. طب ايه اللي يجرى بعد كده؟ اللي يجرى بعد كده انه الصوديوم ايونز والبوتاسيوم ايونز اللي جوه دي بوزيتيف ايونز كتيره، فهنا هتتقفل الصوديوم تشانلز وتتفتح البوتاسيوم تشانلز هنا، فنلاقي ان البلو بول اللي هي البوتاسيوم ايونز موف فروم inside to outside. ترجع الحكايه تاني بس يبقى اسمها ريبولاريزيشن. يبقى هنا هتيجي تتحرك التشارج اللي كانت بوزيتيف 40 هتنزل لغايه ما تقل خالص، ده due to the passage of the potassium ions from inside to outside. احنا بنسمي الحكايه دي the repolarization. يبقى كانت هنا polarized at the negative 70 ملي فولت، وبعد كده طلعت بقت بوزيتيف 40، دي اسمها ديبولاريزيشن، وبعدين بتنزل تاني للنيجاتيفيتي بنلاقيها بنسمي الحكايه دي ريبولاريزيشن. يبقى كانت بولاريزيشن، ديبولاريزيشن، ريبولاريزيشن، وبعدين ترجع تاني polarization, depolarization, repolarization and so on. طيب خلي الناس لاحظت ان النيرف امبولسز اللي كانت عندي نيجاتيف 70 نزلت هنا حبه شويه، هنقول اللي بتاعتها بعد شويه. يبقى هنا ده اللي بيحصل لو حصل ستيميوليشن للنيرف امبولسز او النيرف ممبرين at a certain point. هنا بيقول لك what would happen of the arrival of the stimulus during the refractory period. احنا قلنا من شويه ان كان نيجاتيف 70 ملي فولت بيطلع بوزيتيف 40، بينزل تاني بس بينزل بعد النيجاتيف ملي فولت. محتاجين وقت عشان الممبرين ده يرجع يعمل ريتيرن اتس فيسيولوجيكال بروبرتيز، هيرجع للنيجاتيف 70 ملي فولت تاني. الوقت ده from 0.01 to 0.03 seconds الناس بتسميها refractory period. Through the refractory period the membrane or the nerve membrane can't respond to any stimulus whatever its strength. So nothing will happen if the nerve impulses arrive during the refractory period. Because through the refractory period the membrane can't respond to any stimulus whatever its strength, because it returns its physiological properties to be ready to respond to a new stimulus to transmit another nerve impulse. يعني النيرف impulses كانت في الأول polarized at negative 70 ملي فولت. حصل إن الصوديوم ايونز move from outside to inside. لما الصوديوم ايونز دي اتحركت من بره لجوه بقى جوه في بوزيتيفيتي عالية بعد ما كان نيجاتيف، فجوه بقى بوزيتيف وبره بقى نيجاتيف، سميناها ديبولاريزيشن. بعد كده تتفتح التشانلز بتاعة البوتاسيوم فتخرج البوتاسيوم اللي جوه بره فترجع لي الستيت هنا تاني بنسميها repolarization. تفضل النيرف impulses pass through polarization, depolarization, repolarization and so on. But the nerve membrane need about 0.01 to 0.03 seconds to return its physiological properties to be ready to respond to another stimulus. يبقى هنا لما بيوصل أي nerve impulses during the refractory periods, the nerve membrane can't respond to any stimulus whatever its strength, because the membrane return its physiological properties. طيب نيجي هنا بيقول لك the propagation of nerve impulses through the nerve fibers. يعني ازاي تنتشر النيرف impulses كده في النيرف fibers. The depolarization act as a new stimulus for the neighboring points. The impulses is transmitted in the form of waves, polarization, then depolarization, then repolarization, and depolarization, and so on, along the nerve fiber. So, the change of the charge from polarization to depolarization and the return to repolarization that act as the stimulus of the neighboring point. That is the transmission of nerve impulses. كانت positive وبعدين negative، دي بقت depolarization، هتتعكس بقى تبقى repolarization. لما تبقى repolarization ده act as the stimulus of the neighboring point. يبقى تبدأ الصوديوم ايونز عند النيبورينج بوينت move from outside to inside مرة تاني، وبالتالي تتحرك الحكاية بعد ما كانت النيبورينج بوينت دي polarized بقت repolarized. تخرج بقى البوتاسيوم ايونز تاني علشان تفضل يحصل polarization, depolarization, repolarization. That is the transmission of nerve impulses through the nerve fiber. What about the action potential? It is the response of the nerve cells to stimulus, which includes the state of depolarization, repolarization, and that equal 110 millivolt. يعني كانت عندي negative 70 millivolt. Sodium ions move from outside to inside. طلعت حصل change للpotential difference بعد ما كان negative 70 بقى positive 40. طب لما بقى positive 40، لما اشوف الاكشن potential اللي هو ال difference between polarization and depolarization هلاقي ده equal 110 ملي فولت. يعني كان نيجاتيف 70 بقى وصل للزيرو بقى كده 70. يكمل كمان 40 كأنه 70 و 40 يبقى هنا 110 ملي فولت that act at the action potential which a response of the nerve impulses in the form of polarization, depolarization, repolarization and so on. يبقى النيرف impulses دي act as a nerves which pass from the body cell through the dendrites to the body cell through the axon, and it passes through the nerve fiber in the form of the action potential or polarization, depolarization and repolarization. That due to the selective permeability of the nerve fiber which change during the stimulation of the nerve impulses at any point. هنا بيقول لي write short account on the synapse. Synapses دي ايه؟ It is a site where the terminal arborization of one neuron become very close to the dendrites of the next one or the neighbor one. يعني الأكسون بينتهي terminal arborization with the swollen structure and the presence of cleft between the terminal arborization of one neuron and the dendrites of the next. So the synapse is the site between the terminal arborization of the axon of one neuron and the dendrites of the next. There are three types of synapse. Synapse between the two neurons, synapse between neuron and the muscle, synapse between neuron and gland. So that the transmission of the nerve impulses from nerve to nerve and nerve to muscle or from nerve to gland. What about the transmission of the nerve impulses through the synapse? The synaptic cleft is very narrow space between the arborization of one neuron and the dendrites of the next one. The motor impulses is translated into neurochemical transmitter in the form of acetylcholine or noradrenaline. When the synaptic vesicles which become full of the neurochemical transmitter pass through the synaptic cleft, the calcium pump push calcium ions causing rupture of the synaptic vesicles to allow the neurochemical transmitter to pass from the synaptic vesicles through the cleft. The cleft separate a presynaptic membrane from the postsynaptic membrane. دايما بري يعني قبل وبوست يعني بعد السينابتيك ممبرين. يبقى في اتنين ممبرين، واحد قبل وواحد بعد، والكليفت ده بيبقى في النص. The synaptic button containing the synaptic vesicles. The synaptic vesicles filled with the chemical transmitters as acetylcholine or noradrenaline, which play an important role in the synaptic transmission of the nerve impulses. Transmission of the nerve impulses across the synapses. That due to the presence of vesicles that contain the neurochemical transmitters which when the impulses reach the synaptic node, the vesicles secrete chemical transmitters to the synaptic cleft, then the chemical diffuses or the chemicals as acetylcholine diffuses to the dendrites of the adjacent nerve cell where it initiate a new impulses. كأن كان عندنا النيرف ممبرين بتاع ايدي مثلا او عيني او اي حاجه، الستيمولس بيوصل لمكان، جبت ابره او دبوس او حاجه لمست بيها الجلد، الممبرين هنا بتاع النيرف امبولسز كان بولارايزد، يعني الاوتر بوزيتيف والانر نيجاتيف، كان اسمها بولاريزيشن. Polarization with a negative 70 millivolt as a potential difference. لما ألمس الحتة دي هنا the property of the nerve membrane changes. So it allows the sodium ions to move from outside to inside, that it changes the state of polarization into depolarization. But the potassium ions move from inside to outside, that due to the opening of the gates of the potassium ions, that it changes the state of depolarization into repolarization that return its negative 70 millivolt. So the action potential become 110 millivolt. The nerve impulses in this point, or the change of the state from polarization to depolarization and repolarization, that act as the stimulus of the neighboring point. So at the neighboring point, the nerve membrane allows the sodium ions to move from outside to inside, and also changes the state from polarization to depolarization and return its repolarization. So the propagation of nerve impulses takes place in the form of polarization, depolarization, and repolarization, and so on, until the end of the nerve fiber. The nerve fiber or the neuron end with the terminal arborization, but the neuron not attach or adheres to the neighboring one, but the presence of certain cleft between both of them, between the nerve and the nerve, or nerve and muscles, or nerve and the gland. This cleft is called synaptic cleft. So the transmission of nerve impulses takes place by two ways. The first way is the transmission of nerve impulses through the nerve fiber. The second is the transmission of nerve impulses through the synapses. The transmission of the impulses through the synapses takes place by neurochemical transmitters, which transmit from one neuron or the terminal arborization of one neuron to the dendrites of the next one in the form of the acetylcholine, where the presence of the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane can stimulate the membrane to change it from the state of polarization into depolarization. So that start the transmission of nerve impulses through the neighboring neuron in the form of polarization to depolarization and repolarization, and so on. What about the presence of the enzymes, which calls the cholinesterase enzyme as a neuromuscular junction that act as a synapse between nerve and gland, or also between nerve and nerve, or nerve and muscles, that act as a part of the terminal arborization of one neuron. The acetylcholine, which act as a neurochemical transmitter, pass from the presynaptic membrane through the cleft to the postsynaptic membrane, that is the acetylcholine. The acetylcholine stimulate the membrane to change the state of polarization into depolarization by the passage of the sodium ions from outside to inside. But the membrane can still, it is a state of depolarization. يبقى هيفضل كده depolarization علشان احنا فتحنا الجيتس بتاعة الصوديوم ايونز وخلينا الصوديوم ايونز تتحرك من outside الانسايد. طب احنا مش عايزين الستيت دي تفضل كده. لو دي مصل يبقى عملت كونتراكشن وهتفضل عامله كونتراكشن. طب عشان نعمل ريلاكسيشن تاني لازم ترجع لستيت اوف depolarization. يبقى الاسيتايل كولين اللي represented by the right angle in these four sites that should be broken by the action of the cholinesterase enzyme. So the cholinesterase enzyme can break down the acetylcholine after performing its function. يبقى بعد ما جاء الاسيتايلكولين وصل للممبرين ابتدى تفتح الجيتس، خلى الصوديوم ايونز اتحركت من outside الانسايد، حول لي الحاجه بعد ما كانت اسمها polarization بقت depolarization. البولز اللي لونها جرين دي هي الكولينستريز انزيم، الجرين دي كولينستريز انزيم هيعمل لي breaking down the acetylcholine into choline and acetate after performing its function. يبقى كده هنكسر الكولينستريز انزيم الاسيتايلكولين باي ذا كولينستريز انزيم into choline and acetate. رجعت الجيتس مره ثانيه، فده هيرجع لي الحاله بعد ما كانت ديبولاريزيشن ترجع ريبولاريزيشن تاني. يبقى معنى كده ان الكولينستريز انزيم function is destroying the acetylcholine into choline and acetate after performing its function. Then the nerve membrane returns its state of repolarization. طب ايه اللي يجرى لو مفيش عندنا cholinesterase enzyme؟ The membrane is still in the state of depolarization, so the nerve impulses can't pass from one cell to the neighboring one. نرجع تاني للنيرفس سيستم تاني. كنا قلنا ان النيرفس سيستم divided into three main parts: central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord; peripheral nervous system, which is spinal nerves and cranial nerves; autonomic nervous system, which is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. نيجي نشوف أول حاجة في central nervous system, which is the brain. The brain is surrounded by the brain membranes, which are called the meninges. Three membranes that are responsible for the protection and the nutrition of the brain cells. These surround the brain and the spinal cord. The outer membranes that adhere the bones is the dura mater that lines the skull and the vertebra. The second, the pia mater. The pia mater adheres the brain that act as a membrane containing a huge number of blood capillaries to feed the brain, carry the food to the brain, and wastes from the brain to the blood capillaries. The arachnoid that act as a transparent liquid between the pia mater and the dura mater that protect the brain against mechanical shocks. So the three membranes surrounding the brains are: the inner is the pia mater, the outer is the dura mater, but the arachnoid between them. That the diagram which explains the presence of huge number of blood capillaries in the pia mater, the presence of rough connective tissue or rough white fibers in the form of dura mater, but the arachnoid is a transparent liquid between the pia mater and the dura mater that act as a shock absorber to protect the brain against the mechanical shocks. Write short account on the structure of the human brain. The human brain consists of three parts. The first is the forebrain, which consists of brain cortex, thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The midbrain, which is a small piece between the forebrain and hindbrain. The hindbrain consists of the cerebellum, pons varolii, and the medulla oblongata. The brain consists of two parts, or the brain cortex consists of two parts, which are called the brain cortex. The brain cortex, or two cerebral hemispheres, divided into lobes, four outer lobes and the fifth one. The lobes of the brain are five lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the fifth lobe. What about the structure of the brain cortex? The brain cortex consists of two cerebral hemispheres. They separated by the cleft or the suture between them that not separate the two hemispheres completely. The brain cortex is divided into five lobes. The first is the frontal lobe, containing the centers of voluntary movement, memory, and species movement. The second lobe is the parietal lobe, containing the sensory centers of the skin, as the heat, cold, pressure, and the body temperature, and the cold, the heat, and the touch of the body. That's not act as a center of the body temperature, but that can affect with the environmental temperature that surrounds the body. The parietal lobe contains skin sensation. The occipital lobe, containing the vision center. The temporal lobe, that containing the centers of smell and species. That's act as the video to explain the lobes of the brain. That's the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. But the fifth lobe at the below the parietal and the frontal lobe. Each lobe containing a certain center of the sensation of the body. That's the cleft between the two cerebral hemispheres, which form the cranial part or the cerebral part of the brain. The hindbrain consists of pons varolii, medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. That's act as the part of the hindbrain. But the midbrain is the very small part of the brain connected between the forebrain and the hindbrain. That's act as a classification of the centers that located on the lobes that located on the two cerebral hemispheres of the brain. Write short account on the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It's an important, or the thalamus is an important center of the coordination of the different sensation except the smell, because the smell center not reach the thalamus, but it's coordinated by the brain cortex. The hypothalamus is a part of the forebrain which containing the centers of different reflex actions at the centers of hungry, thirsty, satiety, regulation of the body temperature, and addition of the center of sleeping. So that's the centers in the part of the forebrain which is called the hypothalamus. So the forebrain consists of three parts: brain cortex, which is divided into two cerebral hemispheres, thalamus, and hypothalamus. The occipital lobe in the image that explain containing the vision center, the cerebellum responsible for the balance of the body during the walking or the running. Also the parietal lobe containing the centers of hearing and certain reflexes inside this part. The frontal lobe containing the centers of the memory and speech and the voluntary movement. But this part, which is called the medulla oblongata, responsible for the controlling the involuntary actions as increase and decrease the pulsating of blood vessels, and also control the centers of sensation. That is the memory center that located on the frontal lobe of the brain. Write short account in the midbrain. The midbrain is the smallest part of the brain which connects between the forebrain and the hindbrain. It contains the centers of equilibrium, hearing, and vision. It also regulates many reflexes as those related to hearing. So that's the part of the brain which is called the midbrain. The midbrain connects between the forebrain and the hindbrain, which act as a part of the human brain. What would happen in each of the following? Sensory centers in the occipital lobe are damaged. The sensory centers of the occipital lobe is damaged. That's the center of vision. So that losing of the vision sense takes place, and also or that because the occipital lobe containing the vision center. Write short account on the hindbrain. The hindbrain consists of three main parts: cerebellum, pons varolii, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is located at the posterior region of the and consists of three lobes. The main function of the cerebellum is keeping the body balance with the help of the body muscles and the inner ear. So the inner ear, the body muscles, and the cerebellum responsible for the balance of the body. The pons varolii transmit the nerve impulses between the spinal cord and the brain. But the medulla oblongata, containing the vital centers at these of respiration, swallowing, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and pulsating of blood vessels. So what about the very important part of the brain? It is the medulla oblongata. Because the medulla oblongata, if shock of the medulla oblongata exposed to shocks that leads to death. Because the medulla oblongata containing the centers of respiration, pulsating of blood vessels, and the many activities that are responsible for the survival of the individual. From the opposite figure, state the number that indicates each of the following: memory center, hearing center, centers of skin heat sensation. Where is the fifth lobe in the brain cortex? Question number 3, what's the function of the meninges? So what about the memory centers? The memory centers is located at the frontal lobe, which is the part number 4. The hearing center that located at the parietal lobe in the part number 5. The centers of skin sensation at the part number 2, which is the parietal lobe. Where the 5th lobe is located in the brain cortex. The 5th lobe is covered by the frontal and parietal lobe. It is covered by the frontal and the parietal lobe, so that's the 5th lobe. What's the function of the meninges? Protection and denaturation of the brain cortex. They are the membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord, and containing a huge number of blood capillaries with a great amount of transparent fluids that to act as a shock absorber of the brain, that protect the brain against the shocks, and also containing a huge number of blood capillaries to feed the brain. The spinal cord, which is the very important part of the central nervous system. Central nervous system consists of brain and spinal cord. The spinal cord consists of great number of the axons of the nerve cells. Spinal cord exists inside the neural canal in the vertebral column. It is cylindrical cord about 45 centimeters long, hollow, containing a central canal and covered by the meninges, which is the pia, dura, and arachnoid membrane, and dura mater and pia mater and the arachnoid. There are two features divide the spinal cord incompletely into two halves. The spinal cord consists of two layers, outer white layer and the inner gray matter. The gray matter consists of or formed of the nerve cells or the body cells of the nerve of the neurons, but the white matter is act as axons of these cells. The gray matter in the form of H shape with two dorsal horns and two ventral horns. That's the two horns of the gray matter that located inside the spinal cord. We remember that in the brain cortex, the gray matter is the outside, while the white in inner side. But in the spinal cord, the gray matter inside, but the white matter outside. That's the diagram which explains the structure of the spinal cord, which divided incompletely into two halves with the presence of the central canal at the center of the spinal cord. Each nerve of the spinal nerves has two roots, dorsal sensory root and ventral motor one. The sensory impulses can pass through the sensory root, to which is the dorsal root, to the sensory cells inside the spinal cord. Coordination takes place, and the connector with the certain or inside the certain nodes inside the spinal cord forms a suitable response to allow the motor impulses to pass through the ventral root to reach the muscles or glands as the response of the reflex action. So the spinal cord containing the centers of reflex action and also carry the impulses from the body organs to the brain and vice versa. The spinal nerves are 31 pairs of the spinal nerves, 8 pairs of the cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerve. So the number of spinal nerves are 31 pairs. All of them are mixed because each nerve has two roots, ventral and dorsal. The dorsal is a sensory root, but the ventral is a motor root. What about the peripheral nervous system? The peripheral nervous system consists of cranial nerves, which are 12 pairs that connected with the brain. They are sensory, motor, and mixed. The sensory nerves containing sensory fibers and carry sensory impulses from the receptors or sensory organs to the brain. Basomotor nerve containing motor fibers to carry motor impulses from the brain or spinal cord to the responding organs. The mixed nerve containing fibers to carry out both motor and sensory impulses. The spinal nerves are 31 pairs connected to the spinal cord. All of them are mixed. So the central nervous system divided into brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of cranial nerves and spinal nerves, but the autonomic nervous system divided into two main parts. The first is the sympathetic and the second is the parasympathetic. What about the reflex action? The reflex action is the unit of nervous activities. The majority of reflex action consists of 5 elements. The first is the receptor, which is the sense organ or sensory organs. The second is the afferent, which is the second with the sensory neuron. The third is the connector, which act as an intermediate kind of nerve cells. Efferent, which act as the motor neurons. The effector, which is the responding organ as the muscles and the glands. So the reflex action needs the presence of 5 elements, which appear in this video, with the sensory impulses passes through the sensory fibers through the dorsal root of the spinal cord, and the spinal cord forms the pseudoporosponge and allow the motor impulses to pass from the spinal cord to the muscles or glands. So there are 3 kinds of nerve cells: the sensory connector inside the spinal cord, and the motor, which carry the motor impulses from the spinal cord to muscle to allow the muscle to contract. That takes place during the reflex action. So the 5 elements are the sensory organ, the sensory fibers, the connector inside the brain or spinal cord, the motor fibers, and the responding organ. So that's the 5 elements that are responsible for the reflex action. What about the autonomic nervous system? The third part of the nervous system, which is the autonomic nervous system, includes 2 systems: sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary actions of the muscles and the glands. Sympathetic nervous system, the fibers of the system originate from the thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord. But the parasympathetic nervous system, its fibers originate from the brain and the sacral region of the spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system is important as an emergency system, which enables the body to facing the emergency situation. So the sympathetic nervous system accelerate the rate of the heart beating during the critical situation, but the parasympathetic nervous system inhibit the contraction of the heart or inhibit the heart beating. Therefore, the sinoatrial node of the heart is connected with the 2 nerves: sympathetic nerve, which accelerates the rate of the heart beating, and the vagus nerve, which is act as a nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system, which inhibit the heart beating. What about the action of the autonomic nervous system on the body organs? The action of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system acts during the critical situation to allow the body to facing the critical situation, but the parasympathetic nervous system acted during the or after the critical situation to allow the body to return its normal actions. The sympathetic nervous system causing dilation of the pupil eye, but the parasympathetic causing a contraction of the pupil eye. The saliva or the secretion of the digestive glands are decreased or inhibited due to the action of the sympathetic nervous system, but the parasympathetic increase the secretion of the digestive enzymes and also increase the peristalsis of the alimentary canal. The heart beating increased and the heart contract rapidly due to the action of the sympathetic nervous system, but the parasympathetic slowed the heart beating down. The sympathetic nervous system causing a dilation of the bronchi to allow sufficient amount of oxygen to reach the body to facing the critical situation. But contraction takes place of the bronchi due to the action of the parasympathetic nervous system. Also, the alimentary canal at the stomach and the other digestive glands, the sympathetic nervous system that inhibit the secretion of the digestive glands, but the secretion of digestive glands increased due to the action of the parasympathetic nervous system. Inside the liver, the action of the sympathetic nervous system that can change the glycogen which is stored inside the hepatic cells into glucose to increase the glucose level in blood to facing the critical situation. But the action of parasympathetic nervous system is the stimulation of the hepatic cell to secrete bile and also stimulate the pancreas to secrete the insulin hormone and the adrenal gland to secrete the adrenaline hormone, which decrease the glucose level in the adrenal hormone, and the glucagon hormone that's increase the concentration of the glucose, but the insulin that responsible for decreasing the glucose level in blood. The adrenal gland is connected with the sympathetic nerve to secrete sufficient amount of adrenaline hormones that to facing the critical situation, but no parasympathetic gland is connected with the medulla of adrenal gland. But the urinary bladder dilated during the critical situation due to the effect of the sympathetic nervous system. احنا دلوقتي هنبدأ نشوف مجموعة من الأسئلة اللي تقول لنا ازاي نعرف نجاوبها او احنا فهمنا الجزء الأولاني ده ولا لا. نشوف نبدأ بأول سؤال بيقول لي what's meant by the refractory period. احنا عارفين refractory period it's the time from 0.01 to 0.03 seconds that follow the stimulation of the nerve cells through which the nerve cells is not response to any stimulus whatever its strength, to regain its physiological properties to be ready to respond to a new stimulus and to transmit another nerve impulses. الريفراكتوري بيريود دي باين كده كانت عندي نيجاتيف 70 ملي فولت، حصل ان الجيتس بتاعت الصوديوم ايونز اتفتحت، الصوديوم ايونز دخلت جوه، حولت البولاريزيشن اللي كان نيجاتيف جوه بقى بوزيتيف 40، فده اسمه دي بولاريزيشن. تفتح الجيتس بتاعت البوتاسيوم ايونز علشان تخرج البوتاسيوم ايونز فترجع لستيت من بولاريزيشن دي بولاريزيشن ترجع لريبولاريزيشن. بس الحته دي بقى الصغيره دي اسمها ريفراكتوري بيريود. ايه ريفراكتوري بيريود دي؟ انا عايز الممبرين يوصل لي للستيت بتاعه البولاريزيشن ات ريست يعني نيجاتيف 70 ملي فولت. يبقى انا محتاج وقت من هنا لغايه هنا. الوقت اللي انا محتاجه ده from 0.01 to 0.03 second where the membrane return its physiological properties to be ready to respond to another stimulus. يبقى هي الحته الصغيره اللي احنا بنشوفها دي اللي احنا بنقول عليها refractory period where the membrane can't respond to any stimulus whatever its strength. ايا كان السترينث بتاع الستيمولس مش هينفع يحصل له اي ريسبونس طالما هو في وقت الريفراكتوري بيريود اللي هي ال 0.01 to 0.03 after the state of the repolarization. طيب بيقول لي write the position and the function of each of the following. The cerebellum. The site of the cerebellum as the posterior region of the brain. The function keeps the body balanced with the help of the inner ear and the body muscles. That is the function of the cerebellum and the site of the cerebellum, which act as a part of the forebrain. Because the forebrain consists of the for part of the hindbrain. The forebrain consists of brain cortex, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The hindbrain consists of cerebellum, pons varolii, and the medulla oblongata. The next question. Write the position and the function of the pons varolii. Pons varolii, cerebellum, medulla oblongata act as the part of which forms the hindbrain. The pons varolii at the posterior region of the brain connects between the brain and the medulla oblongata. The function transmits the nerve impulses from the brain to the medulla oblongata and vice versa. That's the function of the pons varolii, which act as a part of the hindbrain. The third, the medulla oblongata. The site of the medulla oblongata connects between the pons varolii and the spinal cord. The function transmits the impulses to and from the brain. It containing centers of respiration, swallowing, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and pulsating of blood vessels. If the medulla oblongata is subjected to shock, that leads to this, because of the centers which located in the medulla oblongata, which is the centers of the pulsating of blood vessels and respiration. The next, synaptic vesicles. What about the site and the function of the synaptic vesicles? Synaptic vesicles is located inside the synaptic button. The function, it's filled with the chemical transmitters which play an important role in transmission of the nerve impulse from one neuron to the next one. The thalamus. Thalamus acts as a part of the forebrain, the site between the brain cortex and the hypothalamus. The function, coordination of different sensations except smelling. Sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system acts as a system which its fiber originate from the thoracic and the lumbar region of the spinal cord. The function enables the body to confront means facing the emergency situation or the critical situation. Choose the correct answer. The parasympathetic nerves that connect with the gallbladder are originated from dots. The question asks of the parasympathetic nerves that connect with the urinary bladder. That originate from brainstem, sacral region, thoracic region, lumbar region. We remember that the parasympathetic nerves are originated from the brain and the sacral part of the spinal cord. So the answer is the sacral part because it is a part that facing the urinary bladder. The next. The nerve fiber represents number A, a dendrites of the neuron, an axon of neuron, a dendrites or an axon of neuron, a neuron. The question asks about the nerve fibers. The nerve fibers act as the axons of the neurons only. The next. All the following represent the refractory period except. All the following represents the refractory period except. Is the time needed to pump the sodium to outside the activities or actively? Number B, about 0.01 to 0.03 seconds. Number 3, the membrane responds to stimuli during its period. Number D, the membrane regain its physiological properties. The refractory period is the time from 0.01 to 0.03 seconds where the membrane can't respond to any stimulus. So the membrane can't respond to stimulus, therefore the statements which represent the refractory period, that's the number A, number B, and number D, but number C is not right because the membrane can't respond to any stimulus during the refractory period. The next, from the functions of the hypothalamus: equilibrium of the body, regulation of the sensory impulses, regulation of the body temperature, regulation of reflex action of hearing. The right answer is the regulation of the body temperature. The next, if cerebellum of the rabbit is damaged, the rabbit loses its ability of balance, respiration, digestion, the reproduction. The answer is balance, because the cerebellum is maintaining balance of the body. My dear students, that's the end of this episode. Thank you very much. Goodbye and good luck.